Great. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me here today and being here to listen about lake trout restoration. I'm going to talk about a program that stretches back to 1971 in Lake Ontario. And really want to thank the organizers and the commission and Haley in particular. She loaded 3 versions of my talk, the most recent one at 6:30 this morning. So the shutdown has got me kind of backed up, so thank you, Haley. Appreciate it. The other thing that maybe we should have up here for our check marks is the number and degree of collaboration. It really struck me through the day today at the co-author strings and the logos on all these talks and how they've increased through the years, and on my talk too. It really has increased our breadth of knowledge, our ability to do other surveys, and in last year in particular, the redundancy of the effort we had out there, and we hope this year as well. The other partners came in when USGS wasn't able to field a boat and kept the surveys going. And really want to throw kudos out to Fish and Wildlife Service. Not only are they really a great collaborator now, especially with some of the newer, well, they're new staff to me, but Dimitri's been there for what, 10, 15 years now. They're increasing the program in innovative ways, and they're now bringing people on to be on all the assessments. So it's really helpful, especially in times when resources are limited, and hopefully I won't talk too much. The obligatory FCO slide, Chris already talked about this. To boil it down, we want a self-sustaining stock like the other lakes. The status and trend indicators. The first one, increasing abundance of stock lake trout across a range of spawning ages, is in response to the collapse of the population that I'll show you that occurred in the early 2000s, rebuilding that population up, so we've got a pretty heavy spawning biomass out there. But also the new part about the 2013 version of the FCOs that wasn't in previous FCOs was their presence in the sport fishery, their important presence there. So recognizing that as well, although from some of the things I've heard anglers say recently, maybe it's not so important to them. The progress indicator, of course, is wild fish and increasing those numbers of wild fish and working towards a self-sustaining population. But unlike a lot of the other fish that are targeted in the FCOs, lake trout have a specific restoration plan across the lakes. And I'm going to structure this talk more towards the measures and strategies out of the Lake Ontario plan, with those being our abundance of mature females. And these are targeted towards age 7 females in Lake Ontario. Of course, increasing catches of wild fish. Want to talk a bit about stocking, and not just numbers, but how targets have changed through time and where we're at now in reference to those targets, because the number we're putting out there does have an impact on how we need to go about this if we want to have fish returning to good habitat to spawn in the fall. So we're currently charged by the Lake Ontario Tech Committee to reevaluate our practices for lake trout restoration, see if what we're doing currently, which is basically stuff that was established in the 1980s, mirrors the realities of what we can put in the lake in terms of numbers and what's available in terms of spawning habitat. And then all the things that affect adult survival. Adult survival itself, I don't want to say much about it because it gets pretty messy with all the strains out there, other than saying that population survival has been above 60% for a number of years, the target. But I will show some information about the 2 chief forces of mortality in Lake Ontario: sea lampreys and harvest. Can't get away without the obligatory methods map. Here's the one for the U.S. shore. We have 2 surveys that we do. July survey that targets juveniles, and that's the trawl sites, the T's. And then the fall survey that targets adults with gill nets, all along the U.S. shore, 14 locations for both. However, you remember I mentioned that the RV Caho, the USGS boat, wasn't available this past year. It was in the yard. So those sites didn't get fished in the trawl fishing. We decided, since we had such limited effort available, to do some gear testing in the Eastern Basin to get at this idea whether or not we're missing naturally reproduced fish with our gear that we've adapted to drysenids on the bottom, or if they're just not there. So I'm not going to present a lot of data. I'll just add those native catches to our total trend to show you where we're at through time for that survey. But I will talk about the gillnet survey quite a bit. However, we experienced a similar decrease in effort on the gillnet survey. We were only able to fish 8 of the 14 sites. We did have the Cajo back in September. It got back a week late and promptly broke down when we got it back. So we were only able to get 1 site in out of the Cajo, but Seth Green was able to fish their sites. And so we feel that we have enough effort that we've got a reliable index of the adult population, but it did get a little flaky, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Here's the sites and where the concentrations of the effort is on the North Shore. The survey is a little bit different on the North Shore now. We used to have a lake-wide standardized September survey targeting adults through 1996. From 97 on, the OM&R has been using their community index survey, the appropriate nets and the appropriate times to index the adult stock. Most of that effort is up in the east. They do have some trawling going on too that'll help us inform some of the trends in natural reproduction. But more recently, since 2014, they've added 2 main basin index sites to their survey. Here's our stocking graph on the U.S. side of the lake, lots of colors through time. I just want to focus since the 90s stocking cuts this time period here, heavily dominated by green. I was sitting in the Lake Huron session a couple days ago, or yesterday I guess, and saw the Seneca trends in reproduction there, and looked at this graph, and we were favoring Senecas as well in Lake Ontario for similar reasons, and have been doing so through time, but we've tried to keep a presence of superior strains because with our good sea lamprey control, they do good in Lake Ontario. But we lost the Marquettes in this time period. We had Traverse Islands here and Apostle Islands here, and they didn't do well at all in the lake. Those aren't available to us anymore, so the only superior-like strain that we have available right now, superior lean strain, is Huron Perry Sound wild fish. We've been stocking those fish for 4 years now. They're not into the assessments yet. I'm not going to talk much about them today. The more interesting thing is the Klondikes. So these are the humper morphotype. They spawn and live a little bit deeper in the lake than the leans do. We brought them into Lake Erie first and Lake Ontario shortly after. And we've got some surprising results today from these fish. I want to talk about where we're at quota-wise with reference to the 97 target, 500,000 fish on each side of the lake. More or less, we've been hovering around that for a number of years. The new plan raised the target, but that was based on adding fall fingerlings to the mix, and it was kind of a disastrous experiment, and we've since abandoned those fish. And here's what Steve talked about and Chris talked about earlier today, the new target in response to the predator-prey imbalance in the lake of 400,000 lake trout, and this is where we're going to be over the next several years. It actually went in here, but Larry was pulling his hair out down at Allegheny trying to chase down this disease issue we had, and we had less than our full quota of fish that year. Another multicolored graph representing the strains on the Canadian side. Hovering again around this 97 reference point, this target throughout this time period, exceeded it more recently. Some of this was fall fingerlings, and remember the stocking cuts due to the predator-prey balance issue went in actually this year, but these fish, a lot of these fish were stocked in the fall as fall fingerlings, and the old fall fingerling metric was 2.4 fall fingerlings to every spring yearling, so those numbers are actually a little bit inflated. So this is what we try to get out of the gill nets. This is our mature fish index through time with females in the black, males in the gray, total mature abundance, this black line on the top, and immatures in the white bars. Here's that population collapse. We think that's completely due to a doubling in sea lamprey predation rate on the fishery then. We lost, I think it was 3 cohorts of fish completely from the stock during this time period. Here's the buildup, the recovery of the stock pretty rapidly up to this peak, and then 3 years of decline. So remember, this is the abbreviated survey this year. Only 8 out of 14 sites were fished, yet we had a 50% 1-year increase in the stock, which seemed to be too large to be possible. So we wanted to go back and look at those numbers to see if there wasn't some kind of dilution effect. We missed some low catch sites that would have brought the average down. So what I did was look at just those 8 sites we fished last year back to 2011 and look at the CUEs based on just those sites without the other sites added in. And you can see the result in these black bars is almost a mirror image of the total density, and in some years it is the total density. So we feel like this number is real, it's not due to sampling bias. So we dug a little deeper. And so this messy graph is each specific catch of coated wire tag fish only during that same time period. So there's about 100 fish a year missing from this, and we're catching on average about 600 fish per year that for one reason or other either shed tags or don't get tags at the hatchery. So the total abundance isn't exactly the same between the previous graph and this one. But what I want you to focus in on is, this is age 4, the red's 5, the green's age 6, and this is that time period where the stock recovered to the peak in 2014, and this is the Klondike impact. So Klondikes at that time were recruiting 9 times better than superior strains were, and almost 5 times better than Seneca strains were. This is that period of decline here, which looks like aging of the Klondikes and no other Klondike year classes in that interim to fill in and keep that population up that high. This is the next year class that we stocked, the 2013 year class. It blew the population up again. And in fact, we caught 113 age 5 fish here. 92 of those were Klondikes. 80% of those 92s at age 5 were mature, which is a year earlier than the rest of the strains that we stocked out there. So we had this kind of double effect. So not only did we have more Klondikes per number stocked, they were maturing a year earlier, so they were adding to the adult stock a year earlier and causing that abundance to come up pretty quickly. So this is that impact right here. And when I went back and looked at the performance advantage, we stocked 244,000 Seneca strain lake trout in 2013. 126,000 Klondikes. So that gives you a 10.5-fold advantage of Klondikes over Seneca strains in recruitment to spawning ages in Lake Ontario. So I'd like to suggest from here, like we did back in 2006, that under the great sea lamprey control that we get for Lake Ontario, thanks to the Commission, DFO, and Fish and Wildlife Service, Klondikes are good. Like what we said about Marquettes, but unfortunately we always say it just a little bit too late because like the Marquette story, we're losing Klondikes out of the hatchery. So if there's anything we can do to keep the diversity up, this might be one place to do it. So remember they got 2 advantages. They recruit better to your stock and they mature a year earlier. So here's the same graph, a similar graph from the Community Index Program on the North Shore, lake trout abundance through time. You see the large decline here, post-stocking cuts, and it's kind of swamped out here, so here's the inlay. And remember, most of this effort is in the eastern end of the lake, but a really nice trend of increase going on here. These CUEs are relatively low, that's one to 2 fish per set, and I'm going to show you in the next graph that some of our most important target indices for these surveys are based on the old standardized survey. And we've been talking about this for a couple of years, and this is one of the things we're going to examine in the tech committee chair. They need to be changed. So this is probably one of the most important adult population targets that we need to hit. So these are age 7 and older females, 4,000 grams and above. That number came from both the stock fishery and what fish looked like when we still had native fish out here in the commercial fishery in the late 1800s. So that two fish target here was based on the catches when we first started seeing natural reproduction in the lake. Catches of those big females. When the population rebuilt, we've been at that level on the U.S. side for more or less 8 years. You can see the impact of that rebuilding on the North Shore as well. But it looks like we're far below that target. But remember, this target was based on a different survey. So this target winds up being about 20% of our current mature catch over the last 10 years on the U.S. shore. So if we use that same mentality and bring it to this other survey, this target comes down here around 0.2. And you'll see that for the last 7 or 8 years, we've been at or above that target on both sides of the lake. One of the chief sources of mortality back in the 80s and 90s, under control for a long period of time. This is the harvest. This is Mike Connerton's data and Jeremy's data from the North Shore. These targets were established based on this period, which were ultra-low catch rates, low effort towards lake trout. We saw a blip up in effort during this time period and harvest. Got a little bit worried, but we're right back down, likely in part due to the exceptional Chinook salmon fishery we've got in Lake Ontario recently. So no worries here. Really, this is one of our real good news stories for Lake Ontario. It's not always the same for the other lakes, especially Lake Erie. This is sea lamprey wounding in the fall, so numbers of wounds per 100 lake trout above 433 millimeters caught, and the green is just a reference of the numbers of those fish that show up in our index survey. We've more or less been at or near target since about 1986, and the real good news story for the last 2 years, 2 of the lowest rates we've ever measured out there, so great control. And this is where we want to get to. These are catches of native fish through time at ages 0, 1, and 2. The first thing to notice, lots of zeros, almost no zeros being caught. We think that's due to the gear we're fishing now. Doesn't fish as hard on bottom. And also this trend of fair catches back here, low catches here, and increasing catches again. We sort of expected this from the diversity of the diet of lake trout. So in this time period here, there were plenty of sculpins to eat, and lake trout were eating them. This time period here, the sculpins fell out and the gobies came on. But remember, I showed you where that stock collapsed was right in here, so we didn't have any adults in the lake to produce young lake trout. The stock rebuilt by about 2011, and we got a burst of natural reproduction that, like we didn't expect. This was much higher than we'd ever seen. But the problem with this burst we're seeing is it's mostly coming from one place in the lake. So Brian Wydell and a graduate student that Brian and I have that's also working at our station, Stacy Fergal, she's working on this issue, and Brian and Stacy went back through all the catches excuse me, and standardized them to tow time, catch per unit effort, and plotted it this way. This will be in Stacy's thesis when it comes out next month. And what we're looking at here is catch per unit effort for regions in the lake, going from west to east. So these are those catches off the mouth of the Niagara River. These are the catches in the west part of the main basin, the east part of the main basin, the eastern shore of the main basin, and then the eastern basin. And the first two things that jump out are the catches here and here at the Niagara River, and the catches here in the eastern basin. And on the U.S. side, the lion's share of the historical spawning habitat that was identified in Goodyear is in the eastern end of the lake. So what's going on now? Virtually non-existent natives being produced in U.S. waters of the eastern end of the lake, and we've got a lot of effort up there with all the surveys going on. We do see a smattering through time at the other areas of the lake, most notably along the eastern shore. And a lot of these fish are coming off a site just east of Oswego. And to back that trend up through time, these are the trout catches, again concentrated towards the eastern end of the North Shore. You see that same dip and recovery here. And you see some recent elevated rates during this time. So we wanted to know what was going on in the eastern end of the lake. And so at the same time that this was going on, our U.S. Fish and Wildlife partners, led by Dmitry Gorski, but also including Zai and Chris, and building off of some earlier work that Betsy Traumater at their office had done, we're examining habitat in the Niagara River. And we're tagging a whole bunch of fish with acoustic tags and putting receivers along the river. And they were finding that not only were lake trout using the river, like the anglers were telling them, they were showing up with lake trout and their catches that were running eggs at spawning time in the winter, or in November, that they were concentrating in areas of good habitat that looked like lake trout habitat in the river. And when in fact they went back and sampled some of that, they were catching eggs and larvae produced from the river as well. So we think we're becoming increasingly more convinced that this is the location that's producing that burst of natural reproduction on the western end of the lake. Dimitri, this summer, him and Zai went out and dove on the structure out here, and it looks to be mostly sand out here, not lake trout habitat. So Stacy, for her project, was going to examine a whole suite of factors in the eastern basin around the one spawning shoal that had a lot of work done on it in 1980 by Chuck Kruger, Ellen Marsden, and Dave Perkins. I think I got 1 minute left, so I'm going to try and squeeze this in. So we did a whole bunch of stuff. The most interesting was we brought Ellen Marsden down at ROVs at spawning time in 2017 to look for lake trout. When she did this in Lake Champlain, she was seeing hundreds of fish on the shoals. When she dove in the 80s, she was seeing a fair abundance of lake trout while she was diving out there on the shoals. We saw 5. We had 2 ROVs, one running off of either side of the boat for about 6 hours in the evening and through into total darkness. We saw 5 lake trout, two that looked like pairs and 1 lone lake trout. And we think one of those pairs swam from the ROV on one side of the boat and then went under the boat and got his picture taken on the other ROV. Then we had a carp come in shortly afterwards, and we couldn't get him away. Every time we turned the ROV, he'd swim right in front of the camera and block our vision. But the most striking thing we saw, unfortunately, was this situation. So this is Ellen's scuba diving picture from the 1980s, beautiful cobble. If you're out there on Stony Island Reef, this goes right up onto the beach. It's just perfect lake trout spawning cobble. They had interstitial spaces up to 45 centimeters in this stuff. Again, Dimitri and Zai went swimming that following summer for us. We went out there and the interstices are completely filled up to the top. They excavated some of the material for us, and it appears to be mostly silt and zebra mussel shell fragments. But I want to leave you with a bit of good news here. If you look at these pictures from Lake Ontario earlier on and other places of the lake, similar bottom pictures, every one of these rocks you would expect to have zebra mussels or quagga mussels on them. These are the druses of the mussels that are out there. There's a lot of spaces that don't have mussels. So we think that this infilling may be related to the mussel colonization, and that any repair that we do this may be durable because of the trends that are going on currently in the lake. And I'll leave you with that. I'm not going to read it. I'm done.
One question.